Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our September High Notes presentation. I'm Summer Vanderbilt, and I am joined today by Alyssa Lohman.
Mhm.
She is a mental health therapist, business owner, educator, and consultant dedicated to helping workplaces foster resilience, well-being, and sustainable success. As co-owner of Empowered Pathways, she delivers engaging trainings on burnout prevention, employee mental health, and trauma-informed leadership. Drawing on both clinical expertise and real-world experience, Alyssa partners with organizations to reduce stigma, strengthen teams, and build healthier workplace cultures where employees can thrive.
Mhm.
Alyssa, I will let you take it from here, but I am excited to see what you have for us today. Thanks for joining
Thank
us.
you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me today. So I always like to get to know folks a little bit instead of just me talking into the black void pretty much this whole time. So if you don't mind, as you're kind of coming in, please put into the chat your name, where you're joining us from, what made you interested in joining today's presentation, and what are you hoping to learn from today's presentation. Throughout, we will kind of keep an eye on the chat if you do have any questions or, if I ask for maybe some like comments or kind of just what are your thoughts on a situation, just because I know that sitting and just staring at somebody talking at you for about an hour can be a lot, especially if you're not able to engage with it. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. I like to really jam my presentations packed with a bunch of information, so we'll make sure we get started. So as she mentioned, I am going to be presenting on preventing burnout before it starts, and that's going to be really talking a lot about self-care strategies for a stronger you, but also a stronger team. So just a little bit about me and my background so you have an idea of who the heck this lady is and kind of why she's talking to us about this stuff. As she mentioned, my name is Alyssa Lohman. I'm a fully licensed clinical professional counselor in both Illinois and Missouri. I have my master's degree in clinical community mental health from Western Illinois University, and I've been in the mental health field for about 10 years now, which is weird because I feel like I just started, but also have been in it for a very long time. And I've done a bunch of different things. I've worked in community mental health, I've done crisis, I've worked in like substance abuse and mental health problem solving courts. I worked at SAUE Counseling Services for several years. And more recently, I've been working at group practices. So I currently work at Radson Counseling in Edwardsville, Illinois. But in addition to being a mental health therapist, I also co founded Empowered Pathways, which is my mental health training and consulting company, to really be able to kind of get important topics about mental health out into the real world because I know that mental health isn't just happening in the therapy room with me, right? It's showing up at work, it's happening everywhere. So it's really important for us to talk about how to support folks' mental health in the workplace too. So these aren't going to be kind of like a sequential order we go into, but I'm hoping by the end of today's presentation, you'll be able to understand what burnout is, be able to spot the early signs of it. You'll be able to use some proven self-care strategies to kind of help you stay engaged and energized and stave off that burnout. We use a five-step plan to support yourself, but also your team and improving things like morale, reducing absenteeism, and boosting retention. So raise your hand or maybe put in the chat if you have done any of these things. You've checked work emails on a weekend. What about you've skipped a meal because you were too busy working? You felt guilty for taking a break. You've thought, if I don't do it, no one else will. And if you've ever thought about quitting, even just for a moment because it all felt like too much. So we've all probably been here, right? Where we are just working ourselves so much that we get to a point where we're really neglecting our needs. And so my hope is that we can start to try to identify what are ways to improve self-care to hopefully manage stress better and be able to prevent or recover from burnout. So one of my catchphrases I use with my clients all the time, they probably get sick of me saying it, is a goal without a plan is just a wish. And what I mean by that is if you do not have a plan, these things that you want to achieve just end up being things you say you wish you had, right? I wish I had more time to myself. I wish I could spend more time with my kids. I wish I was hanging out with my friends more. I wish I got to the gym more often. Because if we don't have a plan, it's always just going to be something that feels like an elusive thing we want that we can't achieve. So to improve self-care and prevent burnout, we need a good plan. And this is the plan that I often use that we've kind of built, but you can use a lot of different plans but we want to make sure that we have some steps along the way. And the ones that we're going to be using today is writing a mission statement, assessing our baseline, choosing self-care strategies, setting an action plan, and reassessing and adjusting to kind of see how things are working. And we're going to break down each one and kind of flesh it out a bit more. So step one is writing your mission statement. So I'm sure if you work for a company, you've heard mission statements before, right? But this is kind of the why. What are your values? What is important to you? So something I really want you to consider is, why should self-care be a value for you? And why should it be a value for your company? So what is self-care? We're going to be using this word a lot today, so it's important for us to know what it is. So self-care is the intentional practice of taking care of your physical, mental, and emotional health through daily habits, choices, and boundaries. But really, it's anything you do on purpose to protect and restore your well-being. I think people get really caught on like self-care as certain activities, but self-care is actually more of an intentionality of what we are doing and kind of why we are doing it. So we have different types of self-care. So important things to kind of consider is, how is our physical self-care? How are we sleeping? Are we exercising? Are we eating well, hydrating, attending to kind of our healthcare needs? There's also emotional self-care. So are we able to acknowledge and notice and be able to express and process our feelings and emotions? Mental, so that's a lot of like mental engagement. Are we able to kind of like read and learn and problem solve? Are we able to kind of do some brain hygiene with like mindfulness and meditation? We have a lot of social self-care needs. Are we having healthy relationships and support systems? Are we establishing boundaries with others? There's spiritual self-care, which this does not always have to be religious. It could be nature, it could be reflection, it could just be values-based living. And of course, there's also professional workplace self-care. So taking breaks, setting limits, using PTO, delegating, and things like that. And we'll talk more about examples of self-care throughout. But an important thing to keep in mind is like, okay, so the why. Why does self-care matter? If we feel like it doesn't matter, if we think it's a bunch of woo-woo, we're not going to do it. But self-care truly does matter, especially, around preventing burnout and stress, which we're going to talk about the detrimental effects of those here in a bit. It also supports physical health, so it can lead to better immune function, lower risk of chronic stress effects. It can improve resiliency, productivity, and focus. And it can enhance emotion regulation in relationships. So why burnout prevention and recovery matters, right? So from your very own SHRM, they had a really great mental health in 2024 research series where they highlighted some of these needs, right? So 44% of US employees surveyed feel burned out at work. 45% feel emotionally drained from their work. 51% feel used up at the end of the workday. And workers who are burned out are nearly 3 times more likely to be actively searching for another job. So burnout can do a lot of things, and this is just kind of some of them, but some of the things we notice is decreased productivity, lower quality of work, reduced employee engagement, increased absenteeism, and negatively impacting workplace morale. So I know with business, they're always like, what's the return on investment, right? What's the ROI here? So it's not only important from a human stance, but it's important from a business stance, because improved engagement. So if you are able to have self-care, feel more engaged, you're going to have more profitability. You're going to also notice that self-care reduces sick days and can boost morale, and prevention reduces recruitment and training costs, because as we just mentioned, if somebody is burned out, they're going to be much more likely looking for another job. So what is stress? So we're going to be talking a lot about stress and self-care and burnout. But stress, it's really important to know that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's more of like trying to gauge what is your stress level at, because some types of stress are actually helpful and sometimes the stress are actually really counterproductive and not healthy. So we have kind of this bell curve of stress. So if we have too little stress, you're actually probably not going to feel very motivated or engaged to complete a task. But if you have a healthy level of stress, that can be helpful. So that would be like me doing this presentation, right? If I didn't stress at all, I probably would have thrown something together in 5 minutes, been like, I don't really care, whatever. But I had a healthy level of stress, so I made sure I took my time, I practiced, I went through everything and made it the way I wanted it to be. But when we start to get past the optimum level of stress, that's where we get exhausted, overloaded. We get into more of this like anxiety, panic, kind of like a threat response. And it can lead all the way to burnout, which can also lead to more of like a mental health breakdown. So, stress is really just how your body reacts to any challenge or change that requires attention or action. It can be physical, like pain, it can be emotional, like grief, or situational, like a deadline. It may activate the body's fight, flight, freeze response. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's where we really want to be mindful of like where some of these problems might be kicking in. So there's different types of stress. So acute stress is like short-term, immediate reaction. That's like a car pulls out in front of you, you slam on your brakes. It often resolves quickly, and there's not a whole lot we need to do about it. It's like it peaks, comes back down, you return to baseline. Chronic stress, however, is ongoing long-term pressure. So that might be financial strain, maybe some toxic work environment stuff, and it can damage health if it's sustained. Episodic stress is like frequent bursts of short-term stress. This is common like in the workplace, right? So if you have a high pressure job, if you have deadlines, if you have kind of like a busy season, that might be where you're kind of at a good baseline and then there's like a few weeks, maybe a few months where it's really intense kind of chronic stress, but then maybe it comes back down. Then there is, I can't ever say this, eustress, I think. We're going to call it positive stress. It is more of that helpful and motivating stress, like I mentioned, maybe preparing for a presentation or a big event. And it can promote growth, productivity, resilience, self-efficacy, and all those good things. So, how stress impacts the body and brain. So, with stress, when it gets into more of this problematic level, this is where we start to see a lot of that, like the burden or kind of the impact we're getting from it. So it impacts really your entire body, right? So hormonal imbalances can happen, fatigue and sleep disruption. You can get a lot of GI problems. You can be in physical pain when you have stress. So that can be like chronic pain and headaches and tension. You actually experience a lowered immunity, so you may be more frequently ill, have slower healing. You are more at risk for kind of chronic concerning health conditions like high blood pressure, heart disease, increased risk of stroke. And there's a lot of mental health concerns like anxiety, depression, memory issues, and poor concentration. And something I always like to highlight, because as a fellow workaholic, I understand some people are just like, well, I have to get this done. I can't take a break. I have to be the one to take care of this. I can't stop now. I have so much work to do. However, it's important to know that when you are in this state of stress, it can impact decision making and can impact the effectiveness and efficiency of your work. That's because when we are kind of in this more problematic stress level, it impacts our decision making in a lot of ways. We can get tunnel vision where we really get like super focused on one problem and we completely miss the bigger picture. We become more emotionally reactive where we can have these like decisions becoming more emotional rather than logical. We may be really risk averse or risk seeking, so we might avoid all risk or take a lot of irrational ones. Overthinking or that analysis paralysis, so you may struggle to make any decisions at all. There's also a lot of memory impairment, so it can be harder to recall relevant informations or lessons learned from past experience, kind of like that hindsight. And also bias reinforcement. This is a really important one because when we are in a high level of stress, our brain is trying to just survive, it's not trying to thrive. So it is going to default to all the shortcuts, it's going to go to quick biases, black and white thinking. It is not going to be an efficient problem solver. It is just going to just kind of brunt force its way through a problem. So there's this thing that we talk about a lot in therapy where it's called a window of tolerance. So it's this concept of we all have this window where we're able to have things kind of come in and out, where we're able to tolerate it, regulate, and kind of go back to baseline. how our window of tolerance, like how big it is, depends on a lot of factors. Some are kind of just our general predisposition. So maybe genetics, our temperament, personality. If you have a neurodevelopmental condition like ADHD or autism, that window may already be smaller. But then whenever we are experiencing kind of day-to-day life, our window may actually get bigger or smaller too, depending on what we're doing to kind of take care of ourselves. So in the chat, if you can think about it, what are some things that may make that window of tolerance smaller for you? Where you notice, like, if I don't do this or if I don't have this, I just feel like things that I normally can deal with just become completely unmanageable or you're intolerable. And while you all are throwing those into the chat, I'll talk about things can also positively impact our window of tolerance. So that can make it bigger by maybe doing things like hanging out with friends, being able to have some time off of work. That can also be if we get a really good night's sleep, if we're making sure we're eating all 3 meals a day. Those are all things, physical activity. I heard someone say that can make it smaller. That can definitely be something that makes it bigger too, right? Where it's like maybe you're having a really rough day, everything feels irritating and annoying, and you go for a long walk and you're like, you know what, the world's not so bad anymore. And so, yeah, anything unexpected, lack of sleep, that's a huge one. When we have too much going on, if we get overstimulated, if there's too many demands, too many interruptions, absolutely, that one's very hard for me. Once my train is on a track, it's really hard whenever it feels like it gets derailed by somebody interrupting. So, yeah, those are all things that can kind of improve it or make it smaller. So an important thing to know is within our window, that's where we're able to be regulated, calm, build connection, and that's where like new learning can take place. But when we're popped out of that window, that's when we experience things like fight or flight. So we may be popped up to hyperarousal, where we're like really in this like panic state. We feel like we have to attack a threat. We feel like we have to escape it. And so that's where a lot of avoidance can happen. Oh, sorry. We also can experience hypoarousal, which can lead to a freeze response. I always call this one plain possum, where it's just like you're completely shut down. You're numb, detached, slow, fatigued, shut down, dissociated, maybe just like mindlessly scrolling on TikTok for hours. So our goal with self-care is to kind of expand that window, be aware of what your window is at, and how do we try to prevent you from popping in and out of that window too much, because that's going to also put you at risk of burnout. So what is burnout? So burnout is a state of total depletion. It's emotional, physical, and mental depletion, and it's caused by that prolonged unmanaged stress. The World Health Organization defines it as an occupational phenomenon with three key dimensions. That's exhaustion, so feeling drained and unable to cope, cynicism or detachment, so feeling alienated or negative toward the work you're doing, reduced efficacy, so feeling unproductive or incapable even with effort. And there's a lot of common causes of occupational burnout. These aren't everything, but a lot of things we notice is like an excessive workload, right? Where what is being required of you does not fit into the time of day, the energy, the bandwidth that you have. A perceived lack of autonomy, so being micromanaged, that's a big one because you're not then maybe learning those skills of like self-efficacy. You don't feel like there's really a point of you even being involved on a project or being, a member of the team. If you're not being recognized or rewarded, we really need positive reinforcement. That's something that is very vital to motivation and momentum and kind of maintaining that level of engagement and interest. And bad relationships at work. We spend more time at work than we do with our families. Like, it's really difficult when our workplace maybe does not have the best relationships, and if the work culture overall is negative, maybe toxic. If we feel like we're being treated unfairly, I think also if it feels like there's just a general sense of unfairness, like maybe there's not a sense of predictability, follow through, consistency, and what kind of policies and procedures, how those are going. And when your values and the company's values don't match, right? That's really hard when your moral compass is just not necessarily kind of aligned with the company. So, something else I always like to talk about, because this is one of my specialties, but it's also really important with the workplace, because up to 20% of your workforce may be neurodivergent, and many are masking or navigating hidden barriers daily. So neurodivergence is where somebody has a brain and kind of processing style that functions differently than what is kind of expected. So that would be like conditions such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and things like that. And this, with neurodivergent burnout, it kind of really can exacerbate occupational burnout and has kind of its own special needs that come with it. So that's a form of that profound physical, mental, and emotional fatigue that is specifically with neurodivergent folks. And it can be triggered by things like masking, which is kind of like hiding like what your body naturally needs in order to kind of camouflage or fit in. So for example, I have ADHD. I'm actually pretty hyperactive. So it might be like me crossing my legs very tightly to then not be able to try not to bounce my leg too much during an appointment. Sensory overload, that can be another really big thing. So if like there was a flashing light, that can be very distracting and dysregulating. Executive dysfunction, all of these are a whole other presentation themselves, so I won't kind of get into too much detail. But just keep in mind, executive functioning is kind of like what the brain skills you need to be able to execute a function. So to be able to execute tasks like problem solving, prioritizing, time management, and all of that, and social demands. So these are just some additional things to look for in addition to signs of burnout that may be unique to neurodivergent burnout. That would be things like shutdown, meltdown. So that might be like getting really dysregulated and kind of maybe aggressive or irritable, or it could just be like an intense panic attack. There could be a loss of speech or communication capacity, increased sensory sensitivity or a social withdrawal. There can also be difficulties with basic tasks of living. And recovery often requires unique things too. So that would be things like neurodiversity affirming practices, accommodations, decreasing demands, managing sensory needs, and reduction in masking. And I always like to recommend like universal design because that's a really great way to ensure an accommodating workplace for all employees, regardless of disclosure of neurodiversity or even of disabilities outside of neurodiversity. Okay, so before we jump into step 2, are there any questions that anybody has? Also, I need to drink water, so. And I have my Quattro's cup. I don't know if you all are familiar with Quattro's. It's the best pizza in Carbondale. Okay, I don't think I'm seeing anything, but feel free to send a message in the chat if you have any questions. So step 2 is assessing your baseline. So are self-care practices already in place? And are you and or your employees experiencing burnout? So before we can make changes, we have to know where we're beginning, right? So unfortunately, due to time limitations, we won't be able to do like a full self-care assessment together, but there are a bunch online. I'd be happy to send you one if you are interested. A lot of them are going to look at things like breaking down those different types of self-care and asking, how are you doing in these areas? So physical, are you eating? What are you eating? How often are you eating? Personal hygiene, are you showering? Are you taking care of yourself in that way? Exercise and movement, rest and sleep. Are you attending your healthcare appointments? Psychological and emotional. When's the last time you engaged with a hobby or an interest? Have you taken time off? Have you got out of this, like, kind of like your small bubble and traveled or gone somewhere? What about learning new things, expressing feelings in a healthy way, recognizing strengths and achievements? Social. So, are we spending time with people we like? Are we meeting new people? Are we asking others for help when we need it? That spiritual component. So, are we spending time in nature and meditating, praying, finding meaning, setting aside time and thought for thought and reflection? And are we participating in causes that are really important to us? There's also a lot of professional self-care. So, improving our professional skills and learning new things. Are we saying no? Are we taking on projects that are interesting and rewarding? Are we making time to talk and build relationships with colleagues? Do we take breaks during work? I'm terrible about taking breaks. When I get like locked in on something, I get super hyper focused, and then I look up and it's been like 4 hours. So that is a really important thing to pace yourself. Maintaining balance between professional and personal life. Are you answering emails and taking calls when you're hanging out with your kids or spending time with friends? Making sure we're advocating for fair pay, benefits, and other needs. I know, especially for women, that can be a really hard thing to do. We can feel like it's inappropriate or like, rude to ask, like, hey, how much money am I making? Can I be making more? And things like that. So I'm curious if anyone's comfortable with sharing in the chat, like, what self-care practices do you do already? And does your company do anything to promote self-care? Meditation, journaling, yep. A motorcycle ride, yeah. A personal yes day each season to do whatever I define as fun. I've never heard it described that way, but I am here for that. I might have to ask you, Katie, a little bit more about that. That sounds really interesting. Go to the movies by yourself, hang out with the grandkids. Yeah. Massages, yes. I've been really meaning to schedule one of those. I've been needing that. Anything else? Yeah, these are all great ideas. What about, do you feel like your company promotes self-care? Or is there really an opportunity to practice self-care? Luncheons, yep. Okay. That's always nice. I have learned as I've gotten older, you have to schedule the next hangout before you leave the current hangout, because otherwise you are never going to hang out with your friends again. It just goes into the void. You never actually talk to one another again. So I've gotten better at that, or making it a regularly scheduled thing where it's like, hey, it's the first Saturday of the month or whatever. But yeah, those are all great ideas. So again, we're not going to necessarily do like a burnout assessment, but we're going to look at like what are these signs. So as we go through these, kind of like with the self-care stuff, maybe ask yourself like, am I feeling this way? Am I doing these things? So burnout, a lot of those individual red flags will look like you're constantly tired even after sleep. I hear folks describe this as like a bone deep tired, that you just can't get out of bed. You just feel like you have no energy. There's like no kind of fire burning inside of you at all. You've lost your sense of purpose or joy in work. Maybe you used to really enjoy the work you were doing, you agreed with the mission, and then you just feel like you've lost that. And not only in the work, but a lot of times all people will experience this even outside of work. So hobbies and interests just don't really do it for them anymore. So they're doing a lot more just like dissociative kind of activities like scrolling or just kind of staring at the wall sometimes. You're feeling more numb, disengaged, or emotionally flat. You avoid responsibilities or dread the workday. I hear a lot of folks describe it as like, I just don't want to get out of bed. Like I know the second I get out of bed, that it's just going to be really hard for me to be able to like get going. You're withdrawing from people or isolating yourself. You're really starting to kind of cut yourself out from other people's lives, and small tasks feel overwhelming. I notice with that window of tolerance, small things that can lead to the biggest freakouts, right? I can handle crisis situations super well, but if I'm starting to feel burned out, like if I like spill a glass of water, I'm just like, what is wrong with me? What is like, why is the world out to get me? So little things can just start to feel really overwhelming and just kind of dysregulating. Burnout on a team level. So that can be things like increased absenteeism, right? So if people are really avoiding work, they're dreading work, they're probably not showing up as often. They're missing deadlines. Maybe they're completely forgetting about like tasks or assignments altogether because some of those memory issues. We may also see increased conflict or tension. Again, that window of tolerance gets small. We're not always the most pleasant people to be around whenever we don't have a very high tolerance level. Withdrawal and disengagement in meetings. So maybe they're just like completely checked out, they're not participating, declining performance or engagement overall. And all of this can lead to a cynical work culture. I have definitely worked in a workplace like this before. I don't know if you all have experienced that, but you feel it. The vibes are off. It's very tense, it's very uncomfortable. And a lot of like social interactions end up being kind of like complaining about the job, kind of trauma bonding type stuff, where it's just like, oh my God, look at what atrocity happened with this today. It just ends up being a really kind of negative headspace everyone is in. So, as we've already talked about, like, I won't really go into this because we've already mentioned it, but just a reminder there are impacts of burnout at work. Like, it's not just like oh, this is a feel good thing we should do for our employees. Like, it's going to cost your company time, money, manpower, all of this stuff if you're not investing in it. So step 3 is choosing self-care strategies. So what can you and your company start doing today to improve self-care? So it's really important to keep in mind that there's a difference between managing that like run-of-the-mill stress and burnout recovery. So with regular stress management, we can address like that temporary stress with just short-term solutions. It's like, oh, maybe I stay an hour later at work, get caught up, I feel better by the next day. Maybe I take like a half day, recharge, come back, all good. Burnout recovery, because it's like that bone deep impact, it requires a lot deeper long term process of rebuilding your relationship with work, resetting boundaries, and reconnecting with your identity and values. Because it really is just like this, it impacts kind of all aspects of the job. So I really like this imagery about like with burnout recovery, there's kind of two main things we have to do. One is this faucet, where the faucet is kind of demand. So it's all these things that are kind of coming at you all the time. And it's usually turned up very high whenever we're in that space of high stress and burnout. So we have to reduce that stress by turning that faucet down. And we also have to expand our coping capacity, which is that bucket. Because if it's turned up and there's not enough room, it's just going to continue to overflow. So we have to find ways to decrease stress and increase coping. So how self-care is related to burnout is that self-care is both a preventative and a restorative tool in addressing burnout. It acts as a protective buffer against the buildup of chronic stress by addressing core burnout drivers. It's like, I notice this, I can use this antidote. If I'm emotionally exhausted, I rest, I sleep, I have some boundary setting, I engage in physical activities, I practice mindfulness. If I'm feeling that depersonalization, we need to then feel personal. We need to have social connection. We need to have some gratitude practices, maybe do some support groups, peer mentoring. Reduced accomplishment, then we need to work on feeling accomplished, personal development, reflection, strength-based activities. And once burnout has begun, we want to make sure that self-care becomes an essential part for healing to rebuild energy. Oh, sorry. Need a drink real quick. To rebuild energy, restore mental clarity, and rebuild empathy and purpose. So these are not an exhaustive list by any means, but some personal strategies that can be really important is taking care of the basics and practicing self-care. So when I say basics, that is kind of the foundation of a house, right? So even if you put all of these really fancy things on top of it, like maybe getting your nails done or even like getting a massage or things like that, if you're not taking care of the basics of you're not sleeping, you're not eating, you're not drinking water, you're not getting out in the sun every now and then, it's like a cracked foundation of the house. It's going to be very difficult for all of those things to be able to sustain you when those basic needs aren't being met. So we really have to go back to basics. Identifying strengths and practicing self-compassion and gratitude. So self-compassion, I know that's something that people talk about a lot, but it's super, super important. So, a quick rundown with self compassion. It requires us to acknowledge and notice that struggling or pain is occurring. We have to then try to respond to that struggle or pain with a kindness and a desire to alleviate it. And we have to acknowledge that that pain and struggle is a part of just being a human. It's like a universal cost of like being a human versus like blaming ourselves for it. What I tend to find with a lot of my folks is that if you don't have self compassion, any of these strategies I'm going to give you will not matter because if you don't feel like you deserve to feel better, if you blame yourself for the position that you're in, you are going to think, I just need to work harder, I need to try harder, and I need to get over it. So, self compassion is one of those kind of very foundational building blocks to being able to actually practice self-care. You got to care about yourself to practice self-care. You also want to make sure you're finding ways to increase movement and incorporate more physical activity. I try really hard to stay away from exercise. We all know exercise is important, right? However, movement is going to be key because when you already feel like you have a lot of demands on your plate, the last thing you want is somebody saying, hey, you also need to go to the gym 3 times a week for an hour and you have to drive there and you have to make like spend the time getting clothes ready. All movement is so much more accessible And also, it can be more enjoyable. I always like to ask people, what did you do when you were a kid? What were things that you used to enjoy? Did you dance? Did you play baseball? Did you play volleyball? Look into those things. When I first moved to Edwardsville, I joined like an adult like hip hop class. I looked like an idiot, but I had a really good time. And I would do that any day over trying to get on a treadmill because that's not going to work for me. So we also want to start small too. We want to make sure we're just increasing steps, standing up more often, and things like that. We also, of course, need to make sure our sleep is in good order. Mindfulness and meditation are strategies that are super evidence-based. I always like to remind folks that we can modify these, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Relaxation strategies. My favorite is doing progressive muscle relaxation, which is essentially where you inhale, tense up a major muscle group, hold it for a bit, and then exhale and release it. You may have heard me crunch when I did that because we hold so much tension in our body that we have to kind of lean into the tension to then be able to fully release it. So that's a really good way to relax kind of on the go or kind of at work. Get outside, super important. Touch some grass, sit in the sun for a little bit, and make sure you're building deep and meaningful social connections. We also, of course, need to set boundaries. We need to schedule recovery periods. So what I mean by that is if you have like a really kind of intense, like that episodic stress, if you have a huge deadline and you spent hours working on it, give yourself a recovery period. Don't just jump right back into the next thing. That kind of goes with this idea of energy pacing and audits. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, and I do presentations on it too of assessing what drains you, what fuels you, and how can you be intentional in scheduling those things. I know you can't really get rid of them, but the worst thing we can do is just put 4 things back to back that are draining us without refueling us. It's kind of like trying to go on a trip and you're not planning any gas station stops. Like you have to have a stop to refuel at some point. Reflection tools, so that could be like mindfulness, meditation, journaling. Big one, take full days off without guilt, right? How many of us have taken a day off and the whole time we're spiraling of, oh my gosh, do I actually deserve to take the day? Was it bad enough to take the day? What are they doing without me? Are they upset with me? And how many of us also work whenever we actually take the day off and then we don't get any of the benefits of it? If we choose to relax and take time to ourselves, allow yourself to do it versus robbing yourself of the benefits by having guilt. Guilt is just going to make you feel like you didn't get anything accomplished. Practicing self-advocacy. Oh, I missed delegating and outsourcing where you can. So that's really important I like to use with folks like there's an Eisenhower matrix, which is, it will say important and urgent. Yep, I forget what's on the side. But if it is urgent, so maybe it's something that somebody needs an answer about, maybe it's a deadline, but it's not important for you to be involved in it. Like if it doesn't require your specific skill set, try to delegate or outsource that. You don't have to be the keeper of all things. You do need to use your specializations and skill sets where you need to, but the amount of time people come to me and they're like, hey, what is this? And all I do is Google it. I'm like, I don't have to be the one Googling it. You know how to Google. So it's okay to say no to certain things, right? And then utilizing support system and considering professional support. There is no shame in going to therapy. You don't have to be in burnout breakdown mode for therapy to be effective. It can be a very good preventative tool if you're noticing a lot of that stress building up. So for the actual organization or company, so some things that are really important is creating a culture where stress, overwhelm, and burnout are safe to talk about. We need to make sure we're training leaders to recognize the signs of burnout and how to respond supportively. Leaders should demonstrate healthy work-life boundaries themselves, right? This is a really hard thing where like you have to practice what you preach, because if I have somebody above me saying, hey, take a day off, and then they never take a day off, that makes it feel like, is it actually okay to take a day off? We also want to make sure that we're developing clear role succession plans, like if somebody leaves or is let go, and decision-making protocols. That helps to offload a lot of that decision paralysis too and executive functioning. Plus, it gives people a sense of safety to kind of know what to expect. creating buffer times and check-ins after intense events, whether that be kind of like an interpersonal thing or maybe like an intense event, like a big deadline that came up. Sorry. When possible, we also want to make sure we're making time for one-on-one check-ins. Focus not just on tasks, but also well-being. But please know if you ask somebody how they are doing, please be in a space to actually have them answer honestly, versus shutting them down or kind of discouraging that, because that is going to just kind of create some trust issues within that. And when possible, implementing meeting-free blocks, flexible hours, 4-hour work weeks, remote work where possible. Some additional stuff, just integrating restorative practices into the workday. So that might be just giving them enough time to go for a walk, or maybe like just do a brain break for a little bit. Support ongoing professional development, practice trauma-informed organizational leadership. We want to build peer support structures as much as we can. We need to find ways to measure and monitor staff well-being. We also want to make sure that we're communicating the mission realistically, and we're fostering a culture of appreciation. Work culture is huge in either preventing or stoking burnout. And leadership mindset, right? We really have to move from this like martyrdom to sustainability, because burnout is not a badge and martyrdom is not a badge of honor. So step 4 is setting an action plan. So we always use SMART goals, where it's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So with self-care plans, I always like to use kind of the same principles with like yoga, where there's always a way to modify or create a variation. So there's these ways to be able to make it safer, more accessible, or more challenging. Because if we have a self-care plan that we cannot do on our worst day, that is not going to be an effective self-care plan. We want it to have structure but flexibility. So this is an example. So I will practice 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation 3 times a week for 30 days. The measurable, lock sessions. Achievable, 10 minutes, realistic, not overwhelming, can fit it into my schedule. Relevant, so why are we doing it? Helps reduce stress and improve focus. Is time bound, so we can kind of check in about how we're doing and reevaluate. But we can always make modifications, variations. Maybe lie down instead of sitting up. Incorporate mindfulness into a daily activity instead of it being a separate practice. That's something that's really important that I think people miss, is they're like, I don't want to add another thing to my to-do list. I don't want to add another thing to my schedule. When I practice mindfulness, it's usually, or if I do deep breathing, it's usually while I'm microwaving Easy Mac, and I'm just like, hey, I have 3.5 minutes. I'm going to do deep breathing for 3.5 minutes while I wait. It's not a separate practice. I'm finding little ways to kind of weave it into my day to day. Here's another one, but we're kind of low on time, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that one. So step 5 is reassess and adjust. So what are barriers to self-care? We all know it, right? We're supposed to practice self-care. Everybody preaches it to us, but we're obviously not doing it for a reason. I always like to be curious about what's getting in the way. A lot of times people will say, well, I'm not doing it. I'm not good at it. I'm just failing at it. No, there's something getting in the way. And if we know what the barrier is, we can figure out kind of a solution to overcome it. So what are maybe some barriers to self-care? Anyone willing to share in the chat? Don't know. Something came up. Oh, not enough time. Okay. Sorry, I'm still new to Teams. I'm hoping if it closes, it's not going to break everything. Not a high enough priority. Yep. Guilt. Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, it's like you guys read my next slide. A lot of it's these things. This isn't all of them, but time pressures, feeling like there's not enough time, not having the energy, right? When you are already in burnout, that's the last thing you want to do when you have a misconception about self-care, that it's that you have to do more. Sometimes it's actually that you're doing less. Sometimes it's that you're saying no. Sometimes it's that you're reserving that fuel source, but it's all about intentionality. We also have a lot of all or nothing thinking, and we can kind of get really frustrated if there's not immediate results. So we feel like there's only one way to do it. We feel like if it doesn't work right away, throw it out the window. There's guilt, right? Which is very sad that that's kind of the world we're living in, where being a human and having human needs and trying to attend to those human needs is seen as selfish, where it's really survival. It's making sure that we are showing up and being the person we need to be. But just like you wouldn't blame a car for not being able to drive when it doesn't have gas in it, You just need to find a way to fill up the tank. And so I think we just need to have more of this neutral approach around self-care of it's the fuel source we need to be able to do the things we want to do. It's not a get out of jail free card. It's not us being lazy. It is our way of being able to function. We a lot of times have unrealistic goals. We forget, we have a lack of structure, that lack of planning, and if it's not personalized, right? So as I mentioned, if somebody just gave me a self-care plan of go to the gym 3 times a week, I'm not doing it. I've already failed because it's not something I would personally want to do, but maybe I'll go swimming, maybe I'll go to a dance class. It needs to matter to you, it needs to fit with your schedule, and it needs to make sense to you. So some things to kind of keep in mind as you're doing this plan is what is working and what isn't. What troubleshooting needs to take place? Are we only addressing one area of self-care? Do we have realistic goals and expectations? Do we need to bring a professional into this to kind of have some additional support? So just a couple of like apps and tech that I really like to use. This isn't a comprehensive list. Also, I love resources, so I'll show you my email address here in just a minute. Sorry, if you have any questions, if you have anything you're looking for, just shoot me an email. But these are some of the ones that I use with folks the most often and for myself. I use Finch. It has things on it like, did you drink water today? Did you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Like, it's nothing fancy, but that helps me stay on task because otherwise I may skip doing those things. So these are helpful. There's also a really great website if you do know anyone who's neurodivergent, like that ADHD, autism stuff. There's a huge list of friendly apps and tech from a website called Embrace the Muchness, which is fantastic. And just a couple of like helpful, like more websites, Job Accommodation Network. If you're not already familiar with this, please look into them. I use it all the time, even for folks who aren't exploring accommodation options, like formal accommodations, because they have such a great list of, hey, these are things that could help that you could use for informal accommodations or maybe self-support, or could be a part of that universal design where you're kind of already bringing some of that stuff into the workplace without someone having to ask for it. There's also the American Psychological Association does a lot of great stuff around workplace mental health. NAMI has like a program, it's called Stigma Free, where there's a lot of things about bringing mental health into the workplace. And there was something from like the Surgeon General around workplace mental health and well-being that kind of gives some more specific structures of how to kind of improve mental health in the workplace. So that's my main presentation. But I do always like to share my contact info. As I said, I am a nerd. I like to nerd out about all this stuff all day, every day. Do not hesitate to reach out if you need a referral or any resources or if you have any questions. But any questions from the group? And then I'll go back to this just in case if anyone has that. But any questions, comments, anything you want me to follow up on more?
Alyssa, I had a question that I was thinking
Yeah.
about. Not really a question, maybe a situation, but
Mm-hmm.
how do you think how workforce has changed, allowing more flex work and hybrid? Do you think that has created more of an opportunity for burnout and being able to separate from our day to day?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think there's a lot of potential for good with it, but it also can create some of those kind of more permeable boundaries, right? Where I know, for example, when I'd be working at home, if I was out in the living room, like working on notes, and I'd look over and I'd see dishes in the sink, I'm like, should I be doing the dishes right now? Like, should I be doing that? And I'd like look around and see all the tasks I needed to do. But at the same time, it was nice to be able to kind of address some of those things that typically do get undone or don't get completed because I come home and I'm just completely depleted sometimes. So I think that there's some pros and cons. I think too, having control over your environment, especially if you are neurodivergent, can have a lot of pros to it because then you can control temperature, lighting, if you're able to kind of like have a specific seating position that's more comfortable, having like fidget toys and things like that. So it's hard to say 100% yes or no either way. I think there's pros and cons to both.
All right, it looks like you have a couple, maybe one question in the chat
Yeah.
that's come through.
Trying to see. I'm not seeing a question, but if there's something you see, please let me know.
It looks like, oh, maybe it's not a question. Katie said, I have to thank you for the self-compassion tip of reframing
Mhm.
criticism by asking, how would you respond if a best friend said that?
Yeah.
That's more so a statement than a question. Sorry,
Hmm.
I was
Oh,
reading
that's
it
okay.
quickly.
Yeah, I think self-compassion is the thing that people miss a lot because again, if you're not really caring for yourself, you're not going to do self-care. And so that is a really important thing to be building on and working on as you are also trying to do some of those. And sometimes people are afraid to let go of self-criticism because they feel like that's it that is fueling them. That's the thing keeping them motivated and engaged. But an important thing to keep in mind is that self criticism is actually going to kick us into that threat response I mentioned, which is where we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And we're not going to actually be functioning to that higher level that we need to be effectively productive. It's going to be more like you're treading water. You're expending a ton of energy, but you're not going anywhere. So it really is vital. Again, I'm a workaholic. I love being productive, but self-compassion is a necessary ingredient to that recipe. But we think it's just woo-woo or kind of really, I don't know, like it's weak in some way. And it's like, no, it's just a necessary ingredient.
All right. Well, Alyssa, you brought up a lot of great points today. I know several of you have asked for the presentation, for this recording. As usual, we will get it emailed out with this recording, as well as the SHRM credit for attending if you're after those continuing education credits. Coming up in November, if you are in the Edwardsville, St. Louis area, I would love to invite you all to a live event we are hosting with Sandberg Phoenix. It will be an employment law legal update. I'm going to be asking John Gilbert, the attorney from Sandberg Phoenix, some pressing HR questions and hoping to get some real answers and invite you all to come. That is November 12th. We'll be hosting it at the Ink House and there will be breakfast. So if I'm there, the menu is going to be great. I expect a good menu. So thank you all for attending today. The presentation will be sent out soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.